Shalom and welcome back to another episode of You Decide. In this series, we are re-examining various arguments commonly espoused by many in our New Covenant faith that would suggest that as believers of Messiah Yeshua, we are not supposed to be following the commandments of God. So in this episode, we're going to go back to the Gospel of Mark to see where some claim that Yeshua declared all foods clean, thus eliminating all of the dietary laws for believers in the New Covenant. Now, before we discuss Mark chapter 7 as a whole, let's take a look at the particular verse that is used as proof text that all foods have been declared clean. And then we will back out and look at the chapter as a whole. In verse 19, we read, actually, let's back up to we'll start with verse 17. And after he had left the crowd, speaking of Yeshua, and entered the house, his disciples asked him about this parable. "Are you so dull?" he asked. "Don't you see that nothing that enters a person from the outside can defile them? For it doesn't go into their heart, but into their stomach, and then out of the body." In saying this, Jesus declared all foods clean. Now, in some translations, that last sentence will be in parentheses. Some may even have a footnote, like mine, and my New King James. And the inclusion of that verse makes all the difference in the world. In my Bible, it tells me that that particular verse is not found in the traditional or original text. This is a statement that was added at a later time. By who? Who knows? But that saying, that last sentence, was not in the original text. It could say, thus purifying all foods, or in saying this, Jesus declared all foods clean. But nevertheless, different translations, especially the red letter editions, can't even agree on whether or not those words were actually spoken by Yeshua himself. Some editions have the letters in red, some do not. If that sentence was not in the original text, and you read the context of Mark chapter 7, it is impossible to walk away from this parable with an understanding or the idea that Yeshua declared all foods clean. In fact, when you look at the chapter as a whole, you see that we're not talking about food at all. Yeshua is specifically talking about defilement of the heart and trying to explain that it is not what goes in a man that defiles him, but what comes out. And the chapter begins by a group of Pharisees and scribes that approach Yeshua and ask him that why his disciples are not walking according to the tradition of the elders, but eat bread with unwashed hands. This whole section on defilement has to do with the disciples not adhering to the tradition of the elders or the oral Torah as per the scribes and Pharisees. That is what their issue is with. They are not debating the difference between clean and unclean food. It is about Yeshua's disciples not keeping with the tradition of the elders, the washing of hands prior to them eating, which, by the way, that commandment is not found in the written word of God. That is not in the written Torah. Okay, that is oral law and tradition. And Yeshua's response to the scribes is that, well did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites, as it is written, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. And in vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. For laying aside the commandments of God, you hold the tradition of men, the washing of pitchers and cups, and other such things that you do. And he said to them, all too well you reject the commandment of God that you may keep your tradition. Very powerful words, and I think those words need to be spoken again in our day, as we are guilty of doing the exact same thing. But as you see through this chapter, there is no discussion about clean and unclean food. So fortunately, we have this conversation recorded for us again in the Gospel of Matthew. And Yeshua, at the end of this conversation, brings it back full circle and explains the meaning of this whole conversation. And in Matthew 15, verse 20, he says, after going through a list of things that proceed out of the mouth that come from the heart, in verse 20, he says, these are the things which defile a man, but to eat with unwashed hands does not defile a man. So what is Yeshua taking issue with? Is he taking issue with the Torah? Absolutely not. He is taking issue with the tradition of men. Tradition that these men hold equal to or above the Word of God. And that's what Yeshua is taking issue with. Interestingly, you do not find that statement or verse in Matthew, thus he declared all foods clean. It's not there. And I will suggest to you, it's not there because originally it wasn't here in Mark 7 either. So you see, when you remove the statement, thus Jesus declared all foods clean, and you look at the chapter, at the context, you see a completely different understanding. One, there is no discussion about clean and unclean food. So that statement is, in and of itself, is out of place. Two, we have the evidence that that statement was not included, did not exist in the original manuscript. And then number three, this whole conversation, this whole attack by the scribes and the Pharisees on Yeshua's disciples is over them not following the tradition of the elders, not the written word of God, right? So that's what Yeshua takes an opportunity to call them hypocrites and attacks their tradition as they prop it up as if it's the word of God. So if you go back to the account in Matthew, you will see that the disciples did not understand the meaning of this parable. And that is explained in both Matthew and Mark. But in the accounting in Matthew, we are told that when they separated from the crowd, the disciples asked Yeshua to explain the parable to them. And specifically, it was Peter who asked Yeshua to explain the parable to us, which is very key and ties into our last episode concerning Peter's vision. So the contemporary understanding of this chapter is that Yeshua declared all foods clean. That is also the conclusion that is drawn from Peter's vision in Acts chapter 10. But here it shows us that Peter himself did not walk away from either event with that understanding. Now, how do we know that? Peter is the one here in Matthew asking Yeshua to explain the parable, which Yeshua proceeds to do. And then later in Acts 10, we read Peter's own words to the Lord when he was instructed to rise, kill, and eat was, "Not so, Lord, for I have never eaten anything unclean." So Peter's testimony in the book of Acts, which, by the way, is years later, many years later after this parable, Peter's testimony is that he has never eaten anything common or unclean, which suggests that Peter, after having Yeshua explain this parable in Matthew and Mark, did not come away with the conclusion that Yeshua had declared all foods clean. Peter gives us the testimony that he has never eaten anything common or unclean. That is Peter's response to the Lord when he receives the vision and is told to rise, kill, and eat. And we see that it is Peter himself that is asking Yeshua for clarification on this parable concerning defilement of the heart. And Yeshua explains the meaning of the parable to the disciples. They obviously did not walk away with an understanding that somehow the commandments of God, the word of God, was just annulled and done away with. Peter didn't walk away from this conversation with that understanding, just like he didn't walk away from the vision he received with that understanding. So you decide, in context, what is really being described here. I think it's pretty clear with just the plain sense of the text. It doesn't require some deep understanding and knowledge of the Greek or Hebrew to get the true meaning of these passages. So that wraps it up for this episode. Thank you so much for watching. We really hope that these discussions are a blessing to you in your walk with Messiah Yeshua. So until next time, study to show yourselves approved to God, rightly dividing the word of truth, and work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. Shalom.